AEW All Out 2020 pay-per-view is in the books. I was lucky enough to go to the AEW All Out pay-per-view last year, and this year, of course, I actually almost went, but wound up not getting tickets last minute. I was a bit let down, but now that I think about it, I'm not sure if I'm that let down. Jacksonville's about a 4.5 hour drive from where I live, and, you know, I do miss going to see live wrestling, but, you know, I'm just going to say this. A lot of people really don't like this show. This show is getting hammered right now as not being a very good show, and I will say that I don't think it was a terrible show by any means. I think there was a lot of good on it. But I do feel like when I look back at the previous AEW pay-per-views, and I'm not going to include All In, but you could, this was the weakest AEW pay-per-view so far, in my opinion. And I didn't think it would be, but there were some things that happened that kind of, you know, I don't want to say soured the evening, but that definitely changed the way things were supposed to go. For example, Matt Hardy was legitimately injured in his match with Sammy Guevara. The situation was weird because when they first started this match, I thought it was going to be a pre-taped because it started off in the stadium part and Sammy's driving the forklift or whatever, the whatchamacallit, like the crane thing. And I'm like, okay, this is probably pre-taped. But then soon we found out that, you know, it wasn't the case. And there was a really nasty spot where Matt hit the back of his head on concrete and got a concussion. And the doctor let him actually keep wrestling, which there was some controversy there. There's some people who were really pissed off at AEW for this. But Matt basically couldn't go again, but he did finish the match and wound up, quote, beating Sammy Guevara, even though Sammy got the win first. They couldn't do that because Matt had, you know, Matt had put the stipulation in about his career. So they couldn't actually let it end like that. Very weird stuff, but it was a legitimate injury, and it was nobody's fault, and that kind of hurt the rest of the show. But it wasn't the only thing that was kind of mediocre. The opening match was this match called Tooth and Nail match, which is another one of those cinematic wrestling matches that took place from Britt Baker's dentist office, and I thought it was, so they were trying to be wacky, and the finish I thought was hilarious, and there was some good stuff here, but it also was probably one of the weaker cinematic wrestling matches. Like the Boneyard match was better. Obviously Stadium Showdown was better. The John Cena Bray Wyatt, whatever the hell that was better. Even the Braun Strowman Bray Wyatt, you know, Swamp Thing match or whatever, the Bayou match, even that was better. This was just kind of like a mediocre match. But then we got to the Young Bucks against Jurassic Express, which I was looking forward to, and I really did enjoy that match. Not the best Young Bucks match on pay-per-view. That would probably have to be the Revolution tag match, but it was good, and I thought that Jungle Boy really did a great job here. Obviously, they got plans for Jungle Boy. Not right away, but at some point, Jungle Boy is going to end up getting a push, and I do think that he will end up being a player at some point in the future. Now, on top of that, there were some other good tag matches. For example, on the pre-show, the Dark Order wrestled Private Party, and that was good. And then the World Tag Team title match. The World Tag Team title match with Kenny Omega and Hangman Page, the tag champions, against the Revival, basically, FTR. This match, I thought, was really well worked. I thought the Revival have always been great tag team wrestlers. I felt like this match would have really benefited from a bigger crowd. And I know that, you know, every match could benefit from this, but I mean, this match really did need, I think, a bigger crowd for them to really get into it. And I also feel like, looking back, this show, this was a 4-hour pay-per-view, and I feel like maybe they could have shaven some stuff off of this show. Like, for example, the 8-man tag with the Dark Order against Dustin Rhodes' team, that could have been taken off the pay-per-view, in my opinion. Again, just my opinion. I don't think it was that great. I mean, it had a funny finish. It had some fun stuff, but I don't think it was that great. Again, not terrible, just it wasn't that great. It could have been taken off the show. It could have been a match on Dynamite. And then the Battle Royal, you know, Lance Archer won, and I feel like once Lance Archer won, and my two picks were him and Eddie Kingston, they were the last two guys in, so I got real lucky on those picks. You know, when Lance Archer won, it kind of telegraphed the finish of the main event, because I was like, okay, if Lance Archer's going to go ahead and compete for the world title, even though I think him and MJF could have a good match, we know that him and Moxley will have a great match because they already have. They had this Texas Death match in New Japan Pro Wrestling for the IWGP US title. So we know that these guys have chemistry. And we know that whether it be at Full Gear or whenever the match is, it should be at Full Gear in November. I think it'll be quality. The Mimosa Mayhem between Jericho and Orange Cassidy, I thought was pretty good. I don't know how I feel about Orange Cassidy kicking out of 2 code breakers, including a top rope reverse code breaker. I thought that was maybe a bit much for this match, even though I know it was like the end of the feud. You know, the ending was interesting because Jericho was on the top rope and Orange hit like a double drop kick, or not double drop kick, a drop kick to the top, and Jericho goes into the Mimosa, because what they did was they had these 2 pools of Mimosa like outside the ring on these like platforms. It was very wacky and very unique. And the rules of the match were pinfall, submission, or you have to throw your opponent's entire body into the Mimosa pool. And so Jericho ends up landing in the Mimosa pool, you know, which basically, as Meltzer said in his report, it's classic WCW veteran doing a job without really doing a job. I'm not sure if that's really fair, but I mean, he's right. Like, Jericho didn't really lose in the traditional sense that you would think, but I think it still worked. I think it did still work for Orange Cassidy. I think it did. Also, I should mention, you know, I talked about the middle of the show kind of being a little bit weak. You know, Matt Sydal did appear as the final entrant. That was a big surprise, and I thought it was pretty cool. And then, you know, then the Broken Rules match happened. And then the AEW Women's Championship match happened. It was just kind of okay. Like, I liked it, but I didn't love it. AEW's women's division continues to be its kind of weak spot, if we're being honest. And also, I saw a lot of people criticizing JR for commentary on this show, saying he wasn't very good. The reality is, look, first of all, I love Jim Ross. I have been a supporter of Jim Ross since, like, WCW in the 90s. Like, I had, you know, before he went to WWF, I have been a big fan of Jim Ross. But the reality is, guys, if we're being honest here, Jim Ross has not been himself for a very, very long time. I feel like in 2008, when JR got drafted to SmackDown and wasn't told ahead of time, which really did piss him off, I feel like that broke him. I think that he mentally was never the same. And even though I feel like he did call some great matches since then, like, for example, Undertaker and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania, and some stuff in '09. He also called The Undertaker versus Roman Reigns match pretty decently, and The Undertaker versus Triple H Hell in a Cell in Miami pretty decently. I still feel like he just wasn't the same. Like, that JR is just not the same. And we kind of saw this during his commentary for the New Japan pay-per-view he did a few years ago. You know, the Attitude Era Jim Ross, the Steamboat Ric Flair Jim Ross, the UWF Jim Ross, even like Jim Ross from like 2000, like post-Attitude Era Ruthless Aggression Jim Ross, like that Jim Ross I think was leagues ahead of this Jim Ross. He does come off pretty grouchy, and I know he's had it rough in the past few years. I mean, with the passing of his wife, I know he hasn't had it easy, and I'm glad he's getting paid in AEW, but he's, you know, people are suddenly surprised that he's not that good, but he really hasn't been. I mean, honestly, he really has not been that great for quite some time. We're just being honest here. He does have some on nights, but, you know, he had an off night here, and actually the whole pay-per-view was kind of an off night, if we're being honest. The main event with Jon Moxley and MJF, it was interesting because I was thinking that they might actually put the strap on MJF, but after the Lance Archer kind of finish, like I said earlier, I think that kind of gave away that Moxley was going to win, but he couldn't do the paradigm shift. So what they did was, you know, what I thought was going to happen was that he was either going to use like a roll-up or do something behind the referee's back, and that's pretty much what happened. You know, MJF went out there, and the story of the match was that MJF was giving Mox a challenge because he couldn't do his finisher because his arm was injured, so he worked over the arm. So that was a good story, but there's a spot, which I think told a great story, where MJF starts bleeding real bad. This was a deep, deep cut. Deep blade job. And MJF is like wearing the crimson mask here, folks, like real bad. And the story is that, you know, he grew up like this pompous rich kid who never saw his own blood. That's pretty much the story that they were trying to tell us. And I think it worked, but MJF still was able to man up. So the match got MJF over as a top guy, but he didn't win the match, even though he got over in that aspect. You know, what happened was Wardlow threw the ring in, at MJF to try to cheat, distracting the referee. Well, what happened was while the ref was distracted, Mox got him with the paradigm shift behind the referee's back, because the stipulation was that if he had hit that move, he would have got disqualified and lost the belt. So he hit the move behind the ref's back and got the 1-2-3. So Mox ends up leaving the match with no blood. Meanwhile, MJF is the one that's bleeding. So it sets up Moxley versus Lance Archer at the next pay-per-view. And we might end up getting an Orange Cassidy versus MJF feud, possibly. I don't know. I'm just guessing based on like the way that the finishes were on this show. I wonder what they're going to do with Chris Jericho next. I mean, that's what I'm very curious about, because he's still my favorite performer in the company. Like, overall, most rounded performer. He's a legend. I mean, unquestionably, Jericho's a legend. And I want to see what they do with him next. I, overall, just felt like this was an okay show. Not a complete waste of time, but not a pay-per-view I'm going to be watching, like, multiple times. You know, even the tag match. My favorite match of the night was probably the tag team match, the tag team title match, where FTR won the titles. But still, it just didn't compare to some of the previous tag matches from Kenny Omega and Hangman, with the story now being that Kenny's frustrated and they're teasing that Kenny will turn heel. I thought that maybe Hangman was going to turn heel, but it looks like they're teasing an Omega heel turn. But I'm not really sure if that's really where they're going with it. You know, it's interesting, but Tony Khan said recently that Dynamite is going to be very interesting the next couple of weeks. He's got some big surprises planned. So let's see what happens on Dynamite in the next few weeks after the pay-per-view. Overall, this show is a thumbs in the middle, honestly. Slightly leaning down. Not a bad show, like I said. Not a bad show at all. The guys worked hard, but there were some mishaps. There was some misfires. And Matt Hardy is thankfully, you know, should be convalescing in a hospital bed tonight. We know he had a concussion, and hopefully he'll be okay, and we'll see where things go from here. So they did also announce that Dustin Rhodes is going to wrestle Brody Lee for the TNT title on Dynamite. So they've got a few things planned for that show. Let's see where things go. Overall, like I said, thumbs in the middle, leaning down. What did you think about AEW All Out 2020? I don't think compared to last year's All Out at all. And I know I was there live, so of course I'm going to have a different perspective. But last year's show just clicked. This year, a lot of issues. Also, last year's show felt a bit shorter. This show started to feel very long in parts. So that's never a good thing. And it was only 4 hours. So then again, WWE pay-per-views have been 3 hours, and I think that's a perfect length. So let me know what you think. Thank you. Take care of yourself, and we'll talk soon.